Mops moch se mo. He didn't mean to send it. One wrong tap at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Mason Reed's entire career, everything he'd spent 6 years carefully building, landed in the inbox of the one person who could end it with a single phone call. The message was meant for his best friend. Instead, it went to Vivian Cross, his CEO, the most powerful woman in the building. And what he'd written wasn't professional. It wasn't careful. It was honest. The kind of honest that gets people fired. Mason stared at his phone screen and felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. By morning, he'd either still have a job, or he wouldn't. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that like button right now and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens between Mason Reed and Vivian Cross is the kind of story that reminds you why accidental moments sometimes turn out to be the most important ones of your life. The night it happened, Mason Reed was sitting on the edge of his daughter's bed in the dark, waiting to make sure she was actually asleep this time. Ella had a talent for faking it. She'd go completely still, breathing slow and even, and the second he stood up and took one step toward the door, she'd say something. "Daddy, I forgot to tell you something. Daddy, my stomach hurts a little. Daddy, what happens when stars get old?" 7 years old, and she had the instincts of a hostage negotiator. He sat there another 3 minutes after her breathing settled, watching the small rise and fall of her chest under the comforter covered in cartoon foxes. A nightlight shaped like a crescent moon threw pale orange across the wall. One of her socks had come off and was sitting in the middle of the floor for no discernible reason. There was a half-eaten granola bar on her nightstand that he'd have to remember to throw away before it attracted ants. The apartment wasn't big. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that always smelled faintly of whatever he'd last cooked, a living room with a second-hand couch that was somehow the most comfortable piece of furniture he'd ever owned. It was nothing like the house he and his ex-wife had shared in the suburbs, with the backyard and the 2-car garage and the life that had looked so right from the outside and had been quietly dying for years. But the apartment was theirs, his and Ella's, and it worked. He finally stood, eased out of her room, and left the door open exactly the right amount. She'd told him specifically, not all the way closed, not all the way open. There was a precise angle that she approved of. He'd learned it through trial and error over the course of about a month. In the kitchen, he poured the last of the coffee from the pot he'd made at 7 and forgotten about. It was terrible, thick and bitter and lukewarm, but he drank it standing over the sink because he didn't have the energy to make a new pot, and he needed something to carry him through the next hour of work emails he still hadn't answered. His phone was on the counter next to a permission slip for Ella's school field trip, a grocery list written on the back of a receipt, and a pen with no cap. He picked it up and opened his messages. He had 3 texts from his friend Danny, all sent in a row, in Danny's characteristic style of treating the send button like punctuation. "Dude, you're not going to believe what I just saw call me when Ella's down," Mason typed back without thinking much. He was tired. He'd been on his feet most of the day. The HVAC contractor at work had come in 3 hours late and left 2 hours early and accomplished exactly nothing. And Mason had spent most of the afternoon rerouting maintenance requests and fielding complaints from the 3rd floor about the temperature. His lower back hurt. His eyes were gritty. He had a headache that had been sitting at a 4 out of 10 since around 2 o'clock. He typed the message he'd been half composing in his head since his commute home. It was about his boss, technically not his direct boss, technically the CEO of the entire company, but the person whose decisions filtered down through every layer of the organization until they landed on him like weather. He'd been thinking about her in the fragmented, unbothered way you think about someone who confuses you. Okay, don't laugh, but I've been thinking about Cross all day. Not in a weird way. Just, have you ever watched someone who's obviously brilliant and obviously successful and obviously capable of handling anything, and they just look exhausted in a way no one around them is allowed to notice? Like they've been performing competence for so long they forgot there was ever anything else. I don't know. She walked past me today and I don't think she saw me at all, which isn't unusual, but she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I don't know how to explain it. Never mind. What did you see? He hit send. He set the phone down, picked up his coffee, and drank the last of it. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It wasn't Danny responding. It was a new notification, a delivery confirmation from his messaging app, the kind that only appeared when a message had been read, by the contact it had been delivered to. Mason picked up the phone slowly, the way you pick something up when you already know you've dropped it and broken it and you're just confirming the damage. The conversation thread was open. He could see his message sitting there in the pale gray bubble of sent text. And above it, in the thread name, he saw the name he'd used when he'd saved the contact 3 years ago when he'd first joined the company and been given a directory of executive contacts for emergency maintenance escalations. V. Cross, CEO/Executive Office. Not Danny. V. Cross, sub C, CEO/Executive Office. The read receipt had a timestamp, 11:51 p.m. She'd been awake. She'd seen it. She'd read it. Mason sat down on the floor of his kitchen without entirely meaning to. His back hit the cabinet under the sink, and he just stayed there, phone in both hands, rereading the message he had just sent to his CEO at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He'd written that to his CEO. He'd sent observations about her emotional state, her private exhaustion, her professional performance. He'd described watching her walk past him. He stared at the phone for another 4 seconds and then typed with shaking thumbs, "I am so sorry." That message was meant for a friend. "I apologize completely. I'll understand completely if you need to take action on this. I'm sorry." He hit send and then sat on his kitchen floor and stared at the ceiling. There was no response. He didn't sleep well. He lay on top of his covers fully dressed until midnight, then undressed and got under them and lay there listening to the refrigerator hum and Ella's occasional shifting sounds from across the hall. His brain was doing the thing it did when something had gone wrong and couldn't be fixed, cycling through the same sequence of thoughts in a loop that gained nothing with repetition but couldn't be stopped. He'd been at Hartwell Technologies for 6 years. He'd started as a maintenance tech and worked his way up to facilities manager over time, which had felt like an achievement because it was. He managed a team of 11 people, oversaw maintenance and safety for 4 floors of office and server space, and had a reputation for solving problems quietly, ahead of schedule, without requiring anyone above him to get involved. He was good at his job. He liked his job. The job paid enough, and the health insurance was critical because Ella had seasonal allergies and twice-a-year checkups and had broken her arm at age 5 and would probably, knowing Ella, find other ways to require medical attention in the years ahead. He couldn't afford to lose this job. He thought about the text. He thought about the words he'd used. She looks tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He thought about Vivian Cross at the last all-hands meeting, presenting from her wheelchair at the front of the auditorium with a precision and authority that the room responded to like a physical force, everyone sitting just a little straighter. He thought about the way she'd passed him in the hallway 2 floors below her office that afternoon, moving quickly, eyes somewhere else, a binder in her lap. She hadn't looked at him. People in her position rarely did. He thought about what she must have thought when she read his message. Intrusive, inappropriate, unhinged, probably all 3. He fell asleep somewhere around 2:30 and woke at 6:15 when Ella appeared in his doorway wearing one sock and holding a stuffed rabbit and announcing that it was morning, which he was aware of. The drive to school was 15 minutes on a good day, 25 on a bad one. This was a medium day. Ella talked the entire time about a girl in her class who had gotten a hamster, about the fact that hamsters were technically nocturnal, which she'd learned from a book, about whether they could get a hamster, about whether their apartment allowed hamsters, about whether he could find out, about how she'd already picked a name, and Mason drove and responded in the appropriate places and did not think about the text message for most of it, which was the particular mercy of having a 7-year-old. He dropped her at the school entrance, watched her walk in through the doors in that slightly knock-kneed way she moved when she was carrying her backpack, and then sat at the curb for a moment before pulling back into traffic. He thought about calling in sick. He didn't call in sick. He'd missed 3 days in 6 years, 2 for Ella's flu and 1 for his own, and he wasn't going to start now because of something he'd done and couldn't undo and would have to face either way. He got to the building at 8:14. Hartwell Technologies occupied the top 8 floors of a glass tower downtown, plus 3 basement floors of server infrastructure that Mason understood deeply and found genuinely interesting in the way he found most systems interesting: the logic of how things worked, what failed, what held. He badged in through the parking structure, nodded at Marcus on security, and took the elevator to the second floor where the facilities office sat between the server room access corridor and the HVAC monitoring station. His team was already in. Lynn was at her desk eating a breakfast sandwich and reading something on her phone. Garrett was on a call, pacing with his headset on. 2 of the overnight crew were finishing shift paperwork at the back table. "Morning," Lynn said without looking up. "Morning." He set down his bag, booted up his computer, and sat down. His email inbox showed 43 new messages since last night. Most of them were routine, work order submissions, a flagged issue from the overnight crew about a moisture sensor in the server room corridor, a calendar reminder for the weekly facilities sync at 10. He worked through them methodically. The moisture sensor was a false positive. He could tell from the readings. He rescheduled 2 open work orders. He sent 3 replies that required 3 sentences each and no more. His phone sat on the desk and did not receive any messages from V. Cross, CEO/executive office. By 10 o'clock, he had almost convinced himself that she'd simply ignored the message, deleted it, made a mental note to have someone review his access levels or report him to HR or both, but hadn't done it yet. People were busy. Vivian Cross was presumably the busiest person in the building. He was in the facilities sync at 10:05 when his phone lit up with a calendar notification. Meeting request. V. Cross. 2 p.m. Executive Conference Room 8A. You have been added as a required attendee. Subject: Facilities item. He stared at it for 4 seconds while Lynn continued talking about the quarterly safety walk schedule. Facilities item. There was no other information, no agenda. No assistant's name in the organizer field, just her name, her title, and his name, in a room he'd only been inside twice before in 6 years. The executive floor had a different quality of air than the rest of the building. He'd noticed it the first time he'd come up here to oversee a renovation on the conference rooms, something about the climate control being more precisely regulated, less variable. The carpet was different too, thicker, the kind of carpet that swallowed sound. He took the elevator up at 1:55 and stood in the hallway outside the conference room for a moment, reading the small placard. 8A. The door was frosted glass, and through it he could see the indistinct shape of the room inside. A long table, chairs, a wall of windows that looked out over the city. He knocked, which felt strange on a glass door. "Come in." He'd heard her voice at all-hands meetings, on recorded calls broadcast over the office PA, and a clip someone had sent around from a business interview she'd done 6 months ago. In person and in a small room, it was more direct than he'd expected. No warmth in it exactly, but no coldness either, just a precision that didn't waste syllables. He opened the door. Vivian Cross was at the end of the table, her wheelchair angled slightly away from the head position, which he registered as a choice that probably meant something about how she preferred to occupy a room. She was wearing dark charcoal, a jacket over a fitted shirt, with her hair pulled back, and she had a tablet face down on the table in front of her and both hands resting on the arms of her chair. She was looking at him directly. She was 30 years old. Photographs didn't quite capture the particular quality of her stillness, the way she occupied a space without performing it. Her eyes were dark, and the expression in them was completely unreadable. Mason came to the table and pulled out a chair at a reasonable distance. Not too close, not pointedly far. He sat down and did not say anything because he didn't know what to say and had learned a long time ago that the impulse to fill silence was usually a mistake. "You sent me a text message last night," Vivian said. "Yes." No qualifier, no apology preface. He'd already apologized once, in writing, and adding another one in front of her felt like it would be for his comfort rather than hers. "I'm aware." "You apologized for it." "Yes." "I didn't call you in here about the apology." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with something that wasn't quite curiosity but wasn't nothing either. "I called you in here about the message itself." Mason waited. You said I looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He didn't deny it. The message was right there on her phone. Denying the content would be insulting to both of them. That's what I said. Most people don't notice that. I'm not sure most people look. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable exactly, just present. She picked up the tablet, set it aside again without looking at it. A habit, maybe, or a test. Why were you watching me? I wasn't watching you, he said, and then corrected himself because that was the wrong word for what had actually happened. I noticed you in a corridor for about 4 seconds. I notice things. It's most of what my job is. Facilities management. Yes. You fix things. I manage the systems that keep the building functional, which sometimes means fixing them and sometimes means figuring out why they stopped working in the first place. The corner of her mouth moved in a way that might have been something and might have been nothing. Is that what you were doing? Figuring out why something stopped working? He felt a flush of something, not quite embarrassment, not quite frustration, more like the feeling of being understood slightly more accurately than he'd intended. I was tired, and I was thinking out loud to someone I've known for 10 years. I made a mistake with the contact. I understand if there are professional consequences for that. I didn't bring you up here to issue professional consequences, she said. I brought you up here because in 6 years at this company, you're the first person who has ever said something about me that didn't have an agenda behind it. He looked at her. People say things about me constantly, she continued, her voice still measured, still precise. Board members, staff, the press. Most of it is about my competence, my decisions, my record. Some of it is about my wheelchair, in ways people think I don't hear. What you wrote was neither of those things. Mason didn't know what to do with that exactly, so he said, "It was an accident." I know. Her eyes held his. That's why I believed it. He left the meeting 20 minutes later, walked to the elevator, and stood in it on the way down without pressing his floor button for about 10 seconds before he remembered where he was. He went back to his office, sat down, and stared at his screen. Lynn looked over from her desk. You okay? Fine. You look like you've been to a funeral. Just a meeting. She let it go. Lynn had worked for him for 3 years and had a preternatural ability to read a room, which she usually expressed by reading the room and then immediately deciding it wasn't worth getting involved. He pulled up the moisture sensor report and spent an hour working through the data logs. The false positive had been caused by a temperature differential between 2 adjacent sections of the monitoring grid, a calibration issue, not actual moisture. He wrote up the fix, sent it to the overnight team, and moved on. But the meeting sat at the back of his mind the way certain things did. Not loudly, not urgently, just present. The quality of her attention. The way she'd said I believed it like that was a thing that required explanation, like it was unusual enough to comment on. He thought about the text he'd sent to Danny that night, finally, after everything. Danny's response had been, "Dude, you accidentally texted your CEO about her feelings? Are you alive?" He was, technically, alive. He was employed still, which had seemed uncertain for most of the day. And he had apparently spent 20 minutes in a conference room with Vivian Cross having a conversation that bore no resemblance to the conversation he'd prepared himself for. He picked up Ella from after-school care at 5:30, which she tolerated with limited patience, being the kind of child who experienced waiting as a minor injustice. She had a painting she'd made in art class rolled up under her arm and had decided by the time they reached the car that the painting was going to live on the wall above her bed, and this required immediate logistical planning. "We need a nail," she said. "We have nails. A good nail, a flat nail, like a painting nail. All nails work the same way." She considered this with the skepticism of someone who had been told inaccurate things before. "I want to see them first." He made pasta for dinner, the simple kind, with tomato sauce from a jar and a handful of whatever vegetables he had that hadn't gone soft. Ella helped in the way she liked to help, which was primarily by standing on her step stool at the counter and narrating what he was doing. When everything was ready, she ate most of her bowl, remembered she was going to tell him something, then forgot what it was, then remembered it was about the hamster again. "Her name is going to be Pebble," Ella said. "We don't have a hamster." "I know," But when we do, we'd have to ask the building. I know. She twirled her fork. Can you ask tomorrow? I'll look into it. This was acceptable to her. She moved on to the pasta. He washed the dishes while she did the 20 minutes of reading she was supposed to do for homework, though she interpreted reading broadly and seemed to be mostly looking at the pictures of a book about ocean animals with great enthusiasm. He could hear her making sounds on behalf of the illustrated creatures. He dried the pot and hung it up and looked out the kitchen window at the light fading over the parking lot and the strip of city visible between the buildings across the street. He thought about Vivian Cross in her conference room at 2 p.m. with her hands on the arms of her chair and her eyes on his. You're the first person who said something about me that didn't have an agenda. He didn't know what to do with that. He wasn't sure there was anything to do with it. She was his CEO, and he was a facilities manager, and the conversation had been a strange detour from the route things had been supposed to go. And it was over now. He'd apologized. She'd called him in. They'd talked. And presumably that was the end of it. She'd go back to running her company. He'd go back to managing his floor of systems and his team of 11 and his 2-bedroom apartment with a daughter who had strong opinions about nails. He went to bed at 10:30 and slept better than he had the night before, which wasn't difficult. 3 days later, he received an email from her assistant. Ms. Cross has asked me to schedule a follow-up conversation regarding the Q4 facilities review. Would Tuesday at 3 p.m. work? He stared at it for a long moment. The Q4 facilities review was a thing that happened. He did it every year and submitted the report to operations, which passed it up through management, which eventually reached someone who either acted on it or filed it. He had never once, in 6 years, been asked to present it directly to the CEO. He replied that Tuesday at 3 p.m. would work. He spent more time preparing for that meeting than it rationally required. He pulled the last 3 years of Q4 data, organized his notes on deferred maintenance items, put together a brief summary of ongoing capital projects and their status. It was thorough, more thorough than what he usually submitted, but not because he was trying to impress anyone. He just didn't like walking into rooms unprepared, and he liked walking into this particular room even less unprepared than usual. He arrived at 2:58 and was shown in by an assistant who left them alone with the door not quite closed, which seemed like it might be standard practice and seemed like it might also be a signal of some kind about how this meeting was being framed. Vivian was at the table again, in the same position. She had a coffee cup this time, simple, white, and she was reading something on her laptop when he came in. She closed it without finishing. Mason? First name. He clocked it. Ms. Cross. She gestured at the chair. He sat. Walk me through what you're looking at for Q4. So he did. He walked her through the deferred maintenance list, the HVAC replacement that had been pushed back twice and needed to happen before winter, the elevator inspection that was coming due, the lighting retrofit that would cut energy costs by an estimated 12% if they moved forward. She listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. Most people in his experience listened to facilities reports with about 40% of their attention and checked their phones at least once. She watched him talk. She asked 2 questions, both of them specific, both of them demonstrating that she'd been listening to what he said 2 minutes ago when most people would have moved on. When he finished, she said, "The HVAC replacement. You've pushed it twice. Operations pushed it, budget timing. But you flagged it." I flag everything. That's what the reports are for. What happens if we go another winter without it? The units on floors 6 through 8 are running past their expected operational lifespan. They'll still work, but the probability of a significant failure increases, and a failure midwinter affects the server climate management systems on those floors, which affects uptime. He paused. It's not a crisis, but it becomes more likely to become one. She made a note on a legal pad. Actual paper, handwritten, which he hadn't expected. I'll have it reviewed. I appreciate that. There was a pause that lasted maybe 5 seconds, and then she said, How long have you been doing this? Facilities management? 6 years here. 8 total before that. Do you like it? The question surprised him, not because it was unreasonable, but because it was personal, and nothing in the Q4 discussion had been personal. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about most things. I like systems, he said. I like understanding how things work and what makes them fail. I like that the work is real. There are problems and solutions, and you can see whether you got it right. It suits me. That's a very specific kind of answer. You asked a specific kind of question. She looked at him for a moment. Most people just say yes. Most people say what they think you want to hear. A pause. And you don't. I try not to. It gets confusing to keep track of. She picked up her coffee cup and looked at the window for a moment. The city framed in gray afternoon light, the kind of November sky that committed to nothing. When she turned back, there was something slightly different in her expression, though he couldn't have said what exactly. "You have a daughter," she said. He went still. Not in a bad way, more the way you went still when you weren't expecting a turn in a road. Her name's Ella. She's 7. You raise her alone? I do. How long? 3 years since the divorce. He said it the way he'd learned to say it, without apology, without the slight flinch he'd had at first. It had taken a while to get there. It's good. We're good. Vivian held his gaze. There was something in her face that he recognized, though he couldn't have explained why. The particular quality of someone who has learned to receive information about other people's lives from behind glass. Not without feeling, just without showing it. That must be difficult, she said. It has difficult parts, he said, but most things worth doing do. She looked at him for another moment, then down at her legal pad. I'll review the HVAC situation before end of week, she said. Her voice was back to its professional register, precise, clean, no warmth in it. Thank you for coming up. Of course. He gathered his materials and stood. Mason. He looked back. My name is Vivian. She held his gaze evenly, not like a challenge, just a statement. In these conversations, if that's all right. He considered it for a second, the offer and what it meant, or what it might mean, or what it might just simply be. Vivian, he said. Sure. He didn't tell Danny about the second meeting. Danny would have made it something it probably wasn't, and Mason didn't want the pressure of someone else's interpretation laid over something he hadn't figured out himself yet. What he'd figured out was this. She was not what he'd expected. He'd built a picture of her from 6 years of secondhand information, meeting recaps passed down through management, the annual all-hands address, the occasional hallway appearance from a distance. The picture had been sharp-edged and one-dimensional. The real version was more complicated. She listened better than almost anyone he knew. She asked questions that went straight to the part of the thing that mattered. She sat in her own silences without needing to fill them, which was unusual and which he respected. She also had a careful, habitual quality, like someone who had spent a long time being precise about what she showed people and had gotten very good at it. He thought about what she'd said in the first meeting. You're the first person who said something about me that didn't have an agenda. He thought he was starting to understand what she meant. The following week, she emailed him directly, not through her assistant, from her own address, asking a question about the server room climate data that had appeared in his Q4 report. It was a technical question, specific, and it took him 20 minutes to pull the right data and write a clear answer. He sent it back and got a 3-word reply. That's helpful, thanks. The week after that, she invited him up again. No stated reason, just, would you have time Tuesday afternoon? He said yes. They talked for an hour. It started with the HVAC approval. She'd gotten it pushed through, which he appreciated more than he let on because it had been a genuine concern, and then moved into something less defined. She asked him something about how he managed his team, and he answered honestly, and she pushed on something he'd said, and he pushed back, and they ended up in a 20-minute conversation about management philosophy that had nothing to do with facilities and everything to do with people, and what made them show up or not show up, and how much of that you could control. He drove home thinking about it the whole way. November turned cold. Ella got her class pictures back and was dissatisfied with her hair in them, which had been put in pigtails by her teacher's aide that morning without her input. She was deeply principled about autonomy. He agreed that the pigtails, objectively, were not her best look, and she spent an evening going through the pictures of past years explaining which ones she had liked and why, which he sat through with genuine interest because Ella's analysis of things once she got going, was always more organized than you'd expect. He found out from the building manager that the apartment complex did not permit rodents of any kind, which Ella received with dignified disappointment and then set aside. She started researching fish. He went up to the 8th floor on a Thursday afternoon in late November and found Vivian staring at her laptop with a look he'd come to recognize. Not frustration exactly, more like the face of someone calculating something that wasn't working out. "Bad day?" he said, pulling out his usual chair. "Board meeting this morning." She closed the laptop in the same motion he'd seen before. 2 hours to accomplish 20 minutes of actual substance. Meetings are like that. Most things are like that. She rubbed the side of her neck, the first unconsciously physical thing he'd seen her do. "Tell me something that isn't about quarterly numbers." He thought for a moment. Ella's researching fish. Vivian's expression shifted. It was a small shift, the kind most people wouldn't catch. "Why fish?" "We can't have a hamster. Building policy." So now she's looking at alternatives. She has a notebook. A notebook. She's 7. Everything she cares about gets a notebook. He leaned back in the chair. She had a notebook about dinosaurs, one about birds that can swim, one about which flowers are edible. Don't ask her about edible flowers, unless you have about 45 minutes. Something happened in Vivian's eyes then. Not a laugh, because she didn't laugh, but something adjacent to it. A lightness. There and then not there, the way light moves when a cloud goes over. But he'd seen it. "She sounds specific," she said. "She's exactly like her mother in some ways, and exactly like me in some ways, and completely herself in all the ways that matter." He said it the way he'd learned to say true things, without decorating them. "She's the best part of everything." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the sky was white-gray, the city below moving in its ordinary Friday afternoon rhythm. "I was an only child," Vivian said. She said it like she was testing the weight of information being offered. "My parents were structured. Order mattered. There wasn't a lot of room for notebooks about edible flowers." "What did you have notebooks about?" She considered that. "Business models. I was 12 the first time I wrote up what I thought was wrong with a company I'd read about." "Were you right?" "I was right about some of it. The company folded 4 years later." The corner of her mouth moved. "I didn't cause it." He laughed, a short, real laugh, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not surprise, exactly, more like someone seeing something they'd been told was possible but hadn't actually expected to encounter. "When did you get hurt?" he asked. He said it the way you ask a question when you've decided not to make a thing of asking it, directly, without the softening that would have made it strange. She went still for a second. Not defensive, just taking the question in. "I was 19, car accident. The spinal damage was at T10. "Do you remember it, the before?" "Every day." She said it without drama, without the cadence of someone performing tragedy. Just a fact. "I was in my second year of college. I'd been running 3 miles every morning since I was 16. "I'm sorry." "I've learned to live with it." She paused. "That's not the same as saying it doesn't matter. It's more like you reorganize around it. You figure out what you can build in the space that's left." He thought about that for a moment. "You built a lot in that space." "I built a company." She looked out at the city. "That's not the same thing as building a life." The words landed in the room and stayed there. He didn't say anything for a moment because he recognized the kind of statement that didn't need a response so much as it needed to be heard. He let it sit. "No," he said eventually, "it isn't." She looked back at him. The light from the window caught the sharp line of her jaw, the steadiness of her eyes. She looked for a second exactly the way she had when he'd written that message, like someone carrying an enormous amount of weight with such practiced precision that almost nobody saw it. He'd seen it, though. He'd seen it from 30 feet away in a hallway, and it had cost him 6 hours of lost sleep and an accidental text message, and a month of conversations that had peeled something back from both of them, slowly, the way things came apart when you weren't careful enough to stop them. He wasn't sure he wanted to stop them. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He drove home in the dark, November cold, pressing against the car windows, the city lights bleeding in the rear view mirror. Ella was already at home with the neighbor who sat with her on the evenings he ran late. Mrs. Tran from 4B, who fed her crackers and watched nature documentaries with her, and charged him $12 an hour, which he paid without complaint. He paid Mrs. Tran and took over homework, which was a math worksheet that Ella had done 2/3 of and then abandoned in favor of the fish notebook, which she showed him with the energy of someone presenting a thesis. She had made a list of fish species with a column for hard to take care of and a column for easy to take care of, and a third column she was still working on that seemed to be labeled personality. "Fish don't have personalities," he said. She looked at him the way she looked at him when he said things that were simply incorrect. "They do." "How do you know?" "The book said bettas are aggressive. That's a personality." He couldn't argue with the logic. "Fair." She went through 6 more entries with him, explaining each fish's relevant characteristics with the seriousness of a scientist, and he sat on the edge of her bed and listened and thought about Vivian saying, "I built a company." That's not the same thing as building a life. And he thought about his own life, the apartment, the crackers, and nature documentaries with Mrs. Tran, the math worksheets, the fish notebook. And he thought that his life was small in every sense that mattered, and enormous in every sense that mattered, and that was probably the best thing you could say about a life. He tucked Ella in at 8:45 and sat with her until she actually fell asleep, which took 11 minutes. He left the door open exactly the right amount. In the kitchen, he made a better pot of coffee this time. He didn't send any accidental text messages, but he sat at the kitchen counter for a while with his phone face down and thought about what Vivian's face had looked like when she said something true and unexpected and the particular relief that moved across a person's face when they've said a thing out loud that they've been carrying alone for a long time. He knew what that looked like. He knew it from his own face. He drank his coffee and thought about what came next. Not with dread, the way he'd thought about things after the divorce, and not with urgency. Just with the quiet, attentive feeling of someone watching a system, reading the data, trying to understand what was really happening and what it meant for everything downstream. The city was dark outside the window. Somewhere across the hall, Ella was dreaming about fish with personalities. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and went to bed. The HVAC replacement happened the second week of December. Mason managed the installation personally, not because it required him to, but because he'd been the one arguing for it long enough that he wanted to see it through. He spent 2 days coordinating with the contractor, walking floors, watching the old units come out, and the new ones go in with the particular satisfaction of someone watching a problem actually get solved. The systems on floors 6 through 8 stabilized by end of day Wednesday. He submitted the completion report and sent a brief email to Vivian's assistant flagging that it was done. Vivian replied herself, not through the assistant. "Good. Thank you for staying on it." He read it, wrote back, "Of course," and moved on. This was more or less how things worked between them now. She initiated most of the meetings. He came prepared, they talked, and he left having had a conversation that didn't resemble anything he'd had with anyone else in his professional life, or if he was honest, in any other part of his life either. She thought precisely and expected him to do the same. When he said something imprecise, she'd catch it, not unkindly, just with the raised eyebrow quality of someone who'd decided he was capable of better. He usually was. He didn't talk about it at work. His team knew he was going upstairs occasionally. Lynn had clocked it because Lynn clocked everything, but he kept the explanation vague, and Lynn, to her credit, didn't push. The executive floor was its own ecosystem, and the rest of the building mostly left it alone. He did eventually tell Danny. Danny's response was more measured than he'd expected, which meant Danny was actually paying attention. "So you're having regular meetings with the CEO of a major tech company," Danny had said, who initiated them. "And they've been getting more personal over time. And you're what? Just writing it out?" Mason had said he didn't know what he was doing exactly. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 6 months," Danny said. Set. The message that complicated everything was one he hadn't even remembered sending. 2 weeks before Christmas, he'd been sitting in the break room during a late afternoon lull, texting Danny about, of all things, whether Danny should take a second job offer he'd received or stay where he was. The conversation had been long and detailed, and Mason had been typing with the focused distraction of someone genuinely trying to help, which meant he hadn't been paying quite enough attention to the screen. What he'd intended to do was forward Danny an article about negotiating counteroffers. What he actually forwarded, in the same motion, one wrong contact selected from the dropdown, was an entire thread. 6 weeks of text to Danny. Not just the article. The whole thing. He realized it the moment the confirmation appeared. His stomach dropped with the specific velocity of a man who had done this before. He didn't know precisely which messages were in the thread. He knew broadly. He knew that it contained the original accidental text, which Vivian had already seen. He knew it contained follow-up messages to Danny about the first meeting, the second meeting, the Q4 conversation that had gone sideways into something real. He knew it contained things he'd typed out late at night when Ella was asleep, and he was still processing something she'd said. Messages where he'd been trying to put into words something he wasn't entirely sure he understood yet. Things like, "She runs a company like she's keeping a secret from it." And, "I don't think she trusts Easy. I don't think she trusts at all, actually, which makes the fact that she keeps asking me back up there strange and worth thinking about." And most damningly, near the end of the thread, "I'm not sure what this is anymore. I'm not sure it's just work." He sat in the break room with his phone in both hands, and the particular cold feeling of someone who had just made the same mistake twice and knew it was worse this time. He sent an immediate follow-up. "I'm sorry. That was an accident. I forwarded the wrong thing. You don't need to read it." Then he sat there and waited. There was no response for 4 hours. He went back to work. He did a floor inspection. He handled a malfunctioning card reader on the second-floor entrance and spent 40 minutes on the phone with the security vendor. He picked up Ella and made dinner and did homework and got through the evening on the surface of things, underneath which something was sitting and waiting like a stone in still water. At 9:52 p.m., his phone showed a notification. Not a text. An email from her personal address. Not the executive account. The other one she'd given him 2 weeks ago when they'd had a conversation about direct lines of communication for facilities emergencies. He'd never used it for anything other than its stated purpose. The subject line was empty. The message was 4 sentences. I read some of it. Not all. "I want you to know I'm not going to pretend it didn't arrive. I also want you to know that what you wrote didn't make me angry. It made me think. Can we talk tomorrow?" He read it 3 times. Then he set the phone face down on the kitchen counter, stood there for a moment, and said a word under his breath that he was glad Ella wasn't awake to hear. He wrote back, "Yes, whenever works for you." Her response came in under a minute. 3 p.m., same room. Jeepab. He slept badly again, which was starting to feel like the cost of knowing her. In the morning, he got Ella ready and drove her to school and sat at the curb for longer than usual after she walked in through the doors, watching the place where she'd been. He'd been thinking since last night, not about what she might say, but about what he'd written and whether he stood by it. That was the thing about putting words somewhere. Once they existed, you had to reckon with them. He couldn't walk into that room and disown what he'd said. It had been true when he'd written it. "I'm not sure what this is anymore. I'm not sure it's just work." He still thought that. He'd thought it more clearly since sending the email, not less. He went to work and did the work. He made decisions, managed a small crisis involving a water leak on the 4th floor that turned out to be a supply line fitting that had worked itself loose, and wrote up 3 deferred maintenance items he'd been putting off. He ate lunch at his desk. Lynn brought him a coffee around 2 without asking if he wanted one, which was one of the kindnesses he'd learned to accept quietly and without comment. At 2:55, he took the elevator to the 8th floor. The assistant wasn't at the desk outside the conference room. The room was already unlocked, a dim light on inside. He knocked anyway, force of habit. "Come in." She was at the table. Same position, both hands resting on the chair arms, the tablet face down. But she looked different, and it took him a moment to identify how. She wasn't performing anything. The precision was still there, but the performance of it, the professional remove, the carefully calibrated neutrality, was less intact than usual. She looked like someone who had been thinking since last night and hadn't quite put everything back in its right place yet. He sat down. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He'd learned by now that she didn't fill silence impulsively. Neither did he. They'd established that without discussing it, which was one of the strange things about how they'd learned each other. I read the part where you said you weren't sure what this was anymore, she said. I know. Did you mean it? I don't write things I don't mean, usually. She looked at him steadily. What did you mean by it? He thought about how to say it accurately, not carefully. Carefully implied managing her reaction, which wasn't the approach that had gotten them to this point. Accurately. I meant that when I started coming up here, it was because you called me in, and I came because it was my job and because I'd made a mistake, and I was trying to manage the consequences of that. But it stopped being about that after a while, and I didn't have a good category for what it became. And now? Now I think I do have a category. I just don't know what to do with it. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city was doing its December thing. Gray sky, movement, indifferent. She turned and looked at it, then back at him. You said in one of those messages that I run the company like I'm keeping a secret from it. He didn't deny it. Yeah. What did you mean? He considered. You're good at your job. Everyone in the building knows it, and I think most of them are genuinely impressed by you. But when you're in a room full of people, there's something you keep back. Not strategically, just habitually. Like you've been doing it so long, you don't think about it anymore. She didn't respond to that immediately. She was watching him with the same focused quality she brought to everything, and he had the distinct sense of being understood in a way that was less comfortable and more real than most people managed. When I was 23, she said, I had a relationship with someone I trusted completely. We'd been together since before the accident. After, he stayed. For 2 years he stayed, and I thought that meant something. And then he left. And when he explained why, he said he loved me, but he couldn't spend his life adjusting to my limitations. She said the last 2 words with a flatness that was the opposite of neutrality. It was the tone of someone who had said a phrase so many times, it had been stripped of its original ability to hurt. I decided after that not to give anyone enough access to say something like that again. Mason sat with that for a moment. That makes sense, he said. I know it makes sense. It also... She stopped. Something moved across her face that she controlled before it finished. It's a very efficient way to be alone. He didn't say anything. He understood from experience that some statements were better received than responded to. I'm not telling you this because I want your sympathy, she added. I know. I'm telling you because you already saw it, before I said anything. You saw it in a hallway from 30 feet away, and I've been thinking about that since the first time you came up here, and I still don't entirely know what to do about it. He looked at her. The winter light was low and flat from the windows, and it made everything in the room look a little more like itself, less polished, more present. She looked, he thought, like a person who had arrived at a point they'd been avoiding and didn't entirely regret arriving there. I'm not trying to be inside your life without permission, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know you're not. I also think... He stopped, found the right words. I think you're one of the most interesting people I've talked to in years, and I think the conversations we've been having have been the best part of my week, most weeks. And I don't have a category for that either, but I'm less bothered by not having one than I was before. She looked at him for a long moment. The messages you sent your friend, she said. About me. Were they all like that? Most of them. Some of them were just me trying to figure out what I was thinking. What were you thinking? He didn't hesitate. That you're someone who built a whole world and locked herself out of part of it, and that you deserve to be in all of it. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Some floor below them transmitted faintly through the structure. The city moved beyond the glass. Her hands shifted slightly on the arms of her chair. Not dramatically, just a small change in how she was sitting, like something had released a degree of tension. I don't do this well, she said. Whatever this is. I know. I'm going to be bad at it. I'm not asking you to be good at it. He looked at her steadily. I'm just asking you to keep showing up. She looked at him for another moment, and then, without performance or announcement, something in her face came open. Not completely, not all at once. Just enough that he could see what was underneath the precision and the practiced remove. Just a person, tired and capable and complicated, who had been keeping the world at the right distance for so long, she'd almost forgotten why she'd started. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay. He nodded and didn't make anything more of it, because that was how these things worked. You said what was true and let it stand on its own and didn't dress it up afterward. The weeks between that conversation and Christmas had a different quality to them, not dramatically different. Vivian wasn't the kind of person who changed rapidly or openly, and Mason had long since stopped expecting that from people. What changed was subtler, the rhythm of things. Their conversations expanded at the edges, moved into territories that hadn't been available before. She told him, over the course of 3 separate meetings, more about the accident, the 6 months of rehabilitation, the way her parents had handled it by throwing structure at it, the college professors who'd been either wonderful or catastrophic in how they'd adjusted, the 2 years of rebuilding herself into someone who could exist in a world designed for bodies that worked differently than hers did. She didn't tell it linearly or completely. She offered pieces when they felt relevant and moved on without needing him to respond to each one. He recognized the style. He did the same thing about his marriage. He told her about the divorce in pieces too, not the legal parts. Those were over and documented and lived with. The other parts. The particular misery of realizing a relationship has failed while you're still inside it, before anyone has said anything official. The way his daughter had known something was wrong months before he'd been willing to say so out loud. The morning he'd moved out, and Ella had stood in the doorway of what was now just her room, holding her rabbit. And he told her that he loved her, and she'd said, "I know, Daddy," in the voice of someone far older than 4, and he'd sat in his car for 15 minutes before he could drive. Vivian had listened to that without moving, without the sympathetic face that people sometimes put on, the one that told you they were performing listening rather than doing it. She'd just sat with it. "She sounds like someone who doesn't miss much," she said eventually. "She doesn't." He thought about Ella at the kitchen counter, asking about the hamster, the fish, the nail for the painting. "She's been pretty good about the situation. Better than me, honestly. Kids often are." Something moved through her expression. They don't know enough to protect themselves from the truth yet, so they just take it in and adjust. And adjust? She paused. Adults spend a lot of energy deciding which truths to let in. You included. She didn't deny it. Me, especially. Eat. The company holiday party was a Thursday evening event on the top floor, the kind of thing that Hartwell did professionally and efficiently, with catering and a bar, and the particular quality of corporate socializing where everyone was a little less themselves than usual. Mason went because his team went, and he spent most of the first hour making sure his people were comfortable and handling a minor issue with the venue sound system that he'd been worried about since the setup that afternoon. He didn't expect to see her there. She didn't usually attend the full party. She made appearances at these things, briefly, and left. He was standing near the windows with Lynn and Garrett, listening to Garrett describe a holiday tradition that involved his grandmother and a very specific cookie that apparently took 4 days to make when he saw her come in. She came in with her assistant, a woman named Priya, who had the calm efficiency of someone who managed a great deal and made it look like nothing, and moved along the edge of the room the way she moved through all spaces without calling attention to it. A few people approached her, and she spoke with them in that contained way she had, present and controlled. Then she looked across the room and found him. It was a brief look, 3 seconds. She didn't smile exactly, but something in her expression shifted, the same small opening he'd seen in the conference room, just for a moment, before she looked back at the person she was speaking with. Garrett was still talking about the cookie. Mason finished his drink. Lynn leaned over and said quietly, "She just looked for you." She was scanning the room. She was scanning the room, and then she found you and her face did something. Lynn picked up her own drink. "I'm not saying anything. I'm just noting it for the record. You're always saying something. It's a gift." She went back to listening to Garrett. Mason looked back across the room. Vivian had moved on to another cluster of people, her back to him now, Priya a discreet distance behind. He watched her for a moment, the controlled posture, the economy of her movement, the way every person she spoke with got a specific quality of attention that made them feel like they were the only person in the room, even though he could see, from where he stood, that she was somewhere else inside herself. He knew where she was. She was doing what she always did at things like this, managing her performance of being present while the real part of her waited for it to be over. He understood that. He was doing a version of the same thing. He found her later, near the end of the evening, in the short hallway outside the main event space where the noise dropped to something manageable. She was alone. Priya had stepped away, and she was looking at her phone with the expression of someone not actually reading it. "You survived," he said. She looked up. Barely. She set the phone down in her lap. "How's the sound system?" "Fixed before anyone noticed it was broken," which is ideal. It's what you do. Fix things before anyone notices they're broken. Yes. She looked up at him, and for a moment the noise of the party behind them and the particular weight of December and the months of careful, incremental honesty between them all existed in the same space. She looked tired again, the real kind, the kind he'd first seen in a hallway from 30 feet away. But she also looked like someone who had, in the last few months, started letting herself be seen being tired rather than pretending it wasn't there. "I read the rest of the thread," she said. He didn't say anything. "I read the part where you wrote that I deserved to be in all of it." She held his gaze. "My own life. All of it. I remember writing that. I've been thinking about it since." "And?" She looked at him with something honest and uncertain and not quite comfortable, which was the realest version of her he'd encountered. "And I think I'm starting to believe it." He nodded. He didn't push it further, didn't make it bigger than it was in the moment. Some things were better received small and left to grow on their own. "I'll see you after the holidays," she said. "After the holidays," he agreed. He walked back into the party and found his team and finished the evening doing the ordinary things, refilling drinks, laughing at Garrett's cookie story the second time through, helping Lynn find her coat at the end of the night when the coat check got confused. He drove home through the cold city and thought about nothing in particular, just the lights and the road and the radio low. Ella was asleep, Mrs. Tran reported that everything had been fine, that Ella had eaten her dinner and shown Mrs. Tran 3 pages of fish research and asked very seriously whether Mrs. Tran had ever owned a fish, which Mrs. Tran had not. He paid her and locked the door and stood in the quiet apartment for a moment. He felt, in a way he didn't have specific words for and didn't particularly need, like something in his life was moving again. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the particular feeling of forward motion after a long period of stillness. The kind you don't notice happening until you're already in it and you look back and see how far you've come. He went to bed with the heat ticking through the baseboards and the city quiet outside, and the door to Ella's room open exactly the right amount. January came in cold and flat, the way January did in this city, not dramatically, just persistently. The holidays had given everyone a 2-week pause and then deposited them back at their desks slightly disoriented, moving through the first weeks of the new year with the particular low-grade effort of people readjusting to the ordinary. Mason came back to work on the second Monday of January and found 3 deferred maintenance items waiting for him, a contractor invoice dispute that had apparently been festering since before Christmas, and a voicemail from the second-floor office manager about a thermostat that had been running cold for a week. He worked through all of it by Wednesday. By Thursday, he was back to his normal rhythm, the steady, methodical pace of someone who found stability in systems and had built a functional life around managing them well. Vivian was back by Tuesday. He knew because her light was on in the executive floor when he came in early that morning, which he could see from the parking structure. He noticed this and filed it without deciding what to do with it. She emailed him Thursday afternoon. No preliminary, no subject context. How was your break? He wrote back, quiet. Ella and I went to her grandmother's for 4 days. We drove back through a snowstorm, and she slept the whole way, which was the best possible outcome. How was yours? Her reply took 20 minutes. I worked, caught up on board materials, read 2 books, spoke to my parents on Christmas Day for 40 minutes, which is approximately the right amount of time for everyone involved. A pause in the thread, then, I thought about our conversation at the party. He read that twice, then, which part? Her response was immediate this time. The part where I said I was starting to believe it. I still am. He set the phone on his desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment, then picked it up and wrote, good. Then after a second, I'm glad. They met the following Tuesday. The conversation moved into territory that had become familiar by now, the kind of talking that had layers, where the surface thing being discussed and the real thing being discussed were related but not identical. She asked about Ella, genuinely, in a way that had developed over the last month into something specific. She remembered details, referenced things he'd mentioned in passing, asked follow-up questions that told him she'd actually been listening. He'd noticed this shift and hadn't said anything about it because saying something would have made it self-conscious, and it worked better the way it was. He told her about the drive home through the snowstorm, Ella asleep in the back seat with the rabbit and a blanket, the highway nearly empty, the radio very low. "That sounds peaceful," Vivian said. "It was the closest thing to peaceful I've had in a while." He considered. "She snores a little, which I'm not supposed to tell anyone." Vivian's expression did the thing it had been doing more often lately, the lightness arriving and staying a beat longer than it used to. "That's endearing. Tell her that. I'd like to sometime." She said it without flagging it, the way you said things that were casual and true at the same time, and then moved on before he could respond to it. He kept that in a back pocket and moved on with her. The rumors started, as far as he could tell, somewhere in the middle of February. He became aware of them gradually, the way you become aware of a change in air pressure before a weather system arrives, feeling it before you can name it. Small things. A conversation that stopped slightly too quickly when he walked into the break room. The way one of the senior operations managers, a man named Clifford Baines, who had been at the company longer than Mason, and who had always been professionally civil, became approximately 15% cooler in his interactions without any stated reason. An email thread he was CC'd on where someone had edited something out before it reached him. He could tell by the gap in the conversation logic. He didn't raise it immediately. He wasn't the type to react before he had enough information to understand what he was reacting to. He got more information on a Wednesday morning in late February when Lynn came into his office and closed the door, which she did only when something required the door being closed. "People are talking," she said. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, put her coffee on the edge, and looked at him directly. "About you and Cross." "What are they saying?" "That you've been going up to the executive floor a lot. That she's meeting with you personally and not through the normal channels." She paused. "Some people are speculating about why." Mason looked at her for a moment. "What kind of speculating?" "The kind where they decide the most interesting version of the story is probably true." She picked up her coffee. "I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you what's out there because you deserve to know and because I've worked for you for 3 years and you're not an idiot." "I appreciate that." "I know you do." She stood up. "I just think you should know that people are watching." She left and closed the door again behind her. He sat with that for a while. He knew what the speculation looked like from the outside. Facilities manager, CEO, a pattern of private meetings without clear business justification. He knew how people's minds worked when they were constructing a narrative out of limited information. The version they were constructing wasn't accurate, but it had an internal logic that made it feel plausible if you didn't know what was actually happening. And almost no one knew what was actually happening. He debated whether to tell Vivian and decided quickly that he would, not because he needed her to fix it, but because not telling her would be a form of managing her, and he'd committed implicitly to not doing that. He sent her a message that evening. "I need to mention something when we meet next. Not urgent, just something you should know." Her reply, "Tell me now." He thought about it for a moment, then wrote, "There are rumors going around the company about our meetings. I don't know how specific they are yet. I wanted you to hear it from me." The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "How long has this been going on?" "A few weeks probably. I noticed it this week." A pause. Then, "Come up tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. She was already in conference room 8A when he arrived, and for the first time she looked like she'd arrived there from somewhere difficult rather than somewhere controlled. Not visibly shaken. She didn't do visibly shaken, but there was a tension in the way she was sitting that hadn't been there before. "Close the door," she said. He did, and sat down. "What specifically are people saying?" "I don't know the details. My team lead told me there's general speculation about why a facilities manager is meeting privately with the CEO. People are filling in the gaps themselves. What are they filling in? He said it straight. That there might be a personal relationship, that I might be taking advantage of access I shouldn't have. She looked at him steadily. Something moved through her expression and was controlled. And what do you want to do about it? I want to know what you want to do about it. These conversations have been your choice, your door, your schedule. If this creates a problem for you, I need to know. It creates a perception problem, she said precisely, not an actual one. She looked at the table for a moment. The question is whether I care enough about the perception to change anything. What's your answer? She looked up. I don't want to stop meeting. She said it with the same directness she brought to everything, and he understood that it cost her something. Not the statement itself, but the exposure of it, the admission that something mattered enough to name. But I'm aware that my not caring about perception doesn't mean you're insulated from it. I'm aware of that too. You have a job here, a career, a daughter who depends on your income. She said each item without inflection, like she was making a list he needed to hear. I don't want what's happening here to cost you things that matter. I know that. He looked at her. I'm a grown man, Vivian. I can make my own calls about what I'm willing to risk. She was quiet for a moment. Have you considered that people might question your judgment, that this could follow you professionally? I've considered it. And I decided it didn't change anything. He let that stand on its own. Did it change anything for you? She held his gaze for a long moment and then said, slowly and with the precision of someone choosing words that had real weight, no. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, a siren passed somewhere below the building, faint and remote, the city doing its indifferent thing. We should probably be more careful about how the meetings are documented, he said eventually. Make sure there's a clear operational context for every time I come up here. I'll talk to Priya about it. And maybe don't email me from your personal account. That horse has left the barn. He almost smiled. Yeah. Okay. She looked at him with something that was, he thought, a form of gratitude. Not the expressed kind, not the kind that came with words, but the kind you could see in someone's posture when they realize they've said a hard thing and the other person didn't flinch. I don't have a lot of practice at this, she said. I know. Whatever this is. I know that too. She nodded once, and they let it rest there and moved on. The complaint arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March, and Mason learned about it the way people learn about things that are going to alter their lives. Not through the source, not with context, but as a secondhand fact that landed before he had any apparatus prepared to receive it. He was told by HR. A woman named Sandra Okafor, who had a calm, practiced manner and whom he'd always found straightforward in his limited interactions with her. She called him in at 4:15 and told him, professionally and without editorializing, that an anonymous complaint had been filed with the Ethics and Conduct Office, and that the complaint alleged he had been cultivating a personal relationship with the CEO for professional gain, and that the allegation included language about manipulation and harassment. Mason sat across from Sandra and listened to her explain the process, what the investigation would involve, what his rights were, what was expected of him in the interim, and felt a particular kind of stillness settle over him. Not calm, not panic. The stillness of someone who has been hit and is determining before responding how badly they've been hurt. Am I being suspended? He asked. Sandra paused before answering, which was its own answer. Pending the completion of the initial review, you're being asked to take administrative leave. Paid leave, effective immediately. How long? We can't give a specific timeline at this stage. The process is designed to be thorough. He drove home from that meeting with his hands precisely on the wheel, the radio off, the city moving around him in its ordinary way with no awareness that anything had shifted. He picked up Ella from after-school care. She could tell something was wrong. She was 7 and she was sharp, and she'd had 4 years of practice reading him, and about 20 minutes into dinner she said, "Daddy, what's wrong?" in the direct way she had, not beating around anything. "Work stuff," he said. She considered this. Bad work stuff. Yeah. Does it make you sad? A little. She ate for a moment, thinking. Then she said, I could make you something. What would you make me? I don't know yet. She looked at her plate. Something good? He got through the evening. He got her into bed, sat with her until she slept, left the door the right amount of open. He sat in the kitchen and called Danny, who was quiet and then not quiet, and then very specifically angry on his behalf. Mason let him be angry because someone should be, and he didn't have it in him right now. He did not call Vivian. He didn't know if that was the right call, but it felt like it. Whatever he communicated to her right now would come from a place that was too unsettled to be trusted. He wrote her an email at 11 p.m. I've been placed on administrative leave pending a conduct investigation. An anonymous complaint was filed. I wanted you to hear this from me. I don't know who filed it or what it contains beyond what HR told me today. I'm okay. I'll figure out the right next steps. He read it over. Then he added, I meant what I said about managing my own risks. I'm not saying that's changed. He sent it and went to bed. Oh, the response came at 6:14 the following morning. I know about the complaint. Priya flagged it to me last night. I need you to know I'm not going to let this stand unchallenged. He wrote back, don't do anything that creates more problems than it solves. Her response was immediate. That's my calculation to make. He had to admire that, even under the circumstances. The formal review hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday, 9 days after his suspension. He was entitled to have someone present with him, HR's language, which he'd interpreted as an invitation to bring a representative if he wanted one. He'd contacted a labor attorney through a referral from Danny. The attorney, a blunt and efficient woman named Carver, had reviewed the complaint documentation and told him frankly that it was thin, circumstantial, and anonymous, with no documented evidence of any misconduct, and that his 6-year clean record at the company was a significant factor in his favor. The question is who filed it and why, Carver had said. Anonymous complaints like this rarely come from nowhere. Someone had a reason. He had a suspicion. He didn't have evidence. He kept it to himself and let the process move. The hearing room was a second-floor conference space he'd never been in before, but smaller than the executive floor rooms, less light. Sandra Okafor was there along with a representative from the legal team and a senior HR director named Walsh, who had the quality of someone accustomed to proceedings like this. Mason's attorney sat beside him with a yellow legal pad. They were 20 minutes into the meeting, Mason answering questions steadily, Carver interjecting twice to clarify scope, when the door opened. Everyone looked. Vivian came through the door in her wheelchair, Priya a step behind. She was in dark navy, her hair down for once rather than pulled back, and her face had the complete controlled stillness of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to do and had arrived ready to do it. Walsh half stood. Ms. Cross, I'm aware I wasn't on the agenda, she said. Her voice was level and absolute. I'm also aware that an investigation is being conducted into a member of this company's staff based on his interactions with me, and I have a material interest in the accuracy of this proceeding. She wheeled to the table and positioned herself at the corner nearest the door, facing the panel directly. I'm not interrupting. I'm participating. Those are different things. There was a brief, contained moment where Walsh and Sandra exchanged a look of people recalibrating rapidly. Ms. Cross, Walsh said carefully, our process guidelines. Your process guidelines exist to ensure fairness and accuracy, Vivian said. I am the other party in the alleged conduct. I am the most direct source of information available to this panel. Excluding me doesn't protect the process. It undermines it. She looked at Walsh with the quality of someone who had sat across from boards, regulators, and institutional inertia and had learned exactly how to be immovable without being loud. I'd like to proceed. Walsh sat back down. Mason watched this with the detached focus of someone who had prepared themselves for one version of the morning and was receiving another. Sandra said carefully, Ms. Cross, you understand that your presence doesn't change the scope or outcome of... I understand the scope entirely, Vivian said. What I want to make clear on record is the following. She didn't look at notes. She'd come here with it already ordered in her mind. Every meeting that Mason Reed and I have had over the past 4 months was initiated by me. Every conversation was at my invitation, in my space, on my schedule. At no point did Mason Reed approach me, request access, or create any situation that I did not create or invite first. She paused a single beat. The suggestion that he has been manipulating or harassing me is not only inaccurate, it is insulting to my competence, my judgment, and my ability to manage my own professional and personal relationships. The room was very quiet. He has treated me, she continued, her voice measured and final, with more consistent respect and straightforwardness than most people I interact with in a professional capacity. If that constitutes misconduct under this company's standards, then this company has a problem that has nothing to do with Mason Reed. She stopped. The room stayed quiet. Walsh was writing something. Sandra was looking at her hands. Mason looked at Vivian, and she met his eyes directly, and what he saw in her face was not triumph or vindication, but something more complicated and more real. The face of someone who had walked into a room knowing exactly what it would cost them and done it anyway. He thought about what she'd said in the conference room months ago. I don't do this well. Whatever this is. I'm going to be bad at it. She was not bad at it. She was terrifying at it, in the best possible sense. The hearing concluded without resolution that morning. These things moved on institutional timelines, Walsh explained, but the panel indicated that the additional testimony would be part of the record and that Mason would be notified within the week. Carver, beside him, made a note on her legal pad and said nothing out loud, which was its own form of commentary. In the hallway afterward, Priya stayed discreetly around the corner, and Mason stood with Vivian for a moment in the particular silence of people who have just gone through something together. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. It could create more visibility, more speculation. I know that too. She looked up at him. I decided I didn't care. You told me you'd be bad at whatever this is, he said. I know what I said. That was not bad at it. Something moved through her face, but not the small contained lightness he'd come to recognize, but something fuller, less controlled. She hadn't entirely prepared herself for the other side of doing a brave thing, and it showed. I had time to think on the drive over, she said, about what it would mean to stay quiet, about what kind of person that would make me. What did you decide? That staying quiet about things that are true is a habit I'm done with. He stood with that for a moment. The other thing I decided, she said slightly quieter, is that you matter. Whatever this is. You matter to it, and I'm not interested in pretending you don't to make other people comfortable. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said in the middle of a second-floor hallway, with Priya around the corner and the institutional machinery still grinding behind the closed door. But he held what she'd said the way you held things that were true and precious and slightly terrifying in their implications, carefully, without squeezing, making room for them to be as large as they actually were. Okay, he said. She nodded once. Priya reappeared with a coat, and they moved toward the elevator. Mason stood in the hallway and watched them go, and thought about the 9 days of administrative leave he'd spent in a particular quality of waiting. Not passive, just measured, the way he waited for systems to reveal themselves. And thought about the fact that she'd walked through a door she hadn't been invited through, for him, without being asked. He drove home through the gray March afternoon and picked up Ella early, which surprised and delighted her. She had, in the 9 days he'd been home, become accustomed to having him around during the afternoon and had used this access to show him the fish research in exhaustive detail, to watch 2 full nature documentaries with him, and to explain at some length the social dynamics of her second-grade classroom, which were apparently complex. You're home early, she said, climbing into the car. Good day, he said. She studied him with those sharp, knowing eyes. A really good day? Yeah. He glanced in the rearview mirror as he pulled out of the school lot. A really good day. She seemed satisfied with this and launched into a story about something that had happened at lunch, and he drove through the gray afternoon listening to her voice fill the car and felt, underneath all of it, the uncertainty still unresolved, the process still incomplete, the implications of everything Vivian had said still moving through him like current, something solid, something he recognized after a long time of not having it, something that felt like it was going to hold, The investigation closed on a Friday. Sandra Okafor called him at 10:22 a.m. to deliver the result in the same measured, professional tone she'd used throughout. The complaint had been reviewed, found to lack substantiating evidence, and was being closed without action. Mason would be reinstated effective Monday. His record would reflect no findings of misconduct. The administrative leave would be treated as paid time off with no notation in his personnel file. He thanked her. He hung up. He sat in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and looked at the wall for about 30 seconds. Then he texted Vivian, "It's closed, cleared, back Monday." Her reply came in under a minute. "I know. Walsh informed me this morning." Then, after a brief pause, "I'm glad." He put the phone down and went to tell Ella, who was in her room engaged in the ongoing project of rearranging her bookshelves by a classification system she'd invented herself. She received the news that Daddy was going back to work on Monday with a philosophical acceptance. She'd liked having him home in the afternoons, but she also understood that work was a thing that existed and required his presence. "Will everything be okay now?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Everything's okay." She studied him for a moment, the way she studied things she wasn't entirely sure about, then nodded and went back to her books. He stood in her doorway watching her organize her small world into the system that made sense to her, and thought that everything being okay was both more complicated and more true than the way he'd said it. He came back to work on Monday to find his desk exactly as he'd left it, and his team treating his return with the practiced normalcy of people who had collectively decided not to make it a thing. Lynn brought him a coffee without comment. Garrett updated him on the 2 maintenance items that had come in while he was out. The overnight crew had handled both without issues. Things had run in his absence, which was how things were supposed to run, and which he acknowledged without the complicated feeling that sometimes accompanied it. What had changed was subtler. The slight coolness that had developed in the weeks before the investigation, the conversations that stopped, Clifford Baines's 15%, was gone, replaced by something closer to its opposite. People were careful with him in a way they hadn't been before, with the particular quality of careful that meant they knew what had happened and had formed an opinion about it. He'd been cleared publicly by the CEO herself. That carried a specific weight in an office ecosystem. He didn't seek out information about who had filed the complaint. He'd had his suspicions before the hearing. Baines was the most obvious candidate, a man who had been passed over for a senior operations role the previous year and had developed a habit of finding reasons to be dissatisfied with the company's direction. But suspicion without confirmation was a bad use of energy, and the complaint was closed, and he had work to do. What he thought about more was the mechanism of it, how quickly an inaccurate narrative could take hold, how an anonymous accusation could put a person on the defensive about things that had been private and real and meant something, stripped of context and framed as transaction. He understood why people who had power and exposure learned to keep walls up. He understood it about himself, a little. He understood it about Vivian a great deal. He went upstairs Thursday afternoon. Not a scheduled meeting. She'd texted him Tuesday asking if he had time that week, and he'd said Thursday, and Thursday it was. She was at the table, but not facing it when he came in. She was at the window, looking out at the city, which she rarely did during their meetings. He'd seen her look at the city when she was thinking about something she hadn't decided how to say yet. "Close the door," she said, not turning around. He did. He sat. She turned from the window and came to the table and looked at him with an expression that was, he thought, what she looked like when she'd spent several days working up to something and had arrived, finally, at the moment of saying it. "I want to tell you something I've been putting off," she said. "Okay. I told you that I decided you mattered, that I wasn't interested in pretending you didn't." She met his gaze directly. "I want to be clear about what I meant by that. I'm listening." She was quiet for a moment, the deliberate pause of someone choosing words precisely, not stalling. "I've spent 11 years since the accident being very strategic about what I allowed to get close to me. Work got close. Strategy, problems, systems. I let those in completely because they didn't ask for anything I wasn't capable of giving. People I kept at the distance that made sense." She paused. "You didn't stay at that distance. You kept inviting me back." "I know." She looked at him. "That's what I'm talking about. I kept inviting you back because something about talking to you made me feel like myself in a way that I'd stopped expecting to feel. Not the CEO version, not the version that performs capability for a room, just myself. She said the last word with a plainness that landed harder than anything dramatic would have. I'm not good at explaining this. You're explaining it fine. She looked at him for a moment. I want to try, she said. Whatever this is, I want to try it like it's real, not like it's something I'm observing from a safe distance. He held her gaze. I want that too. I need you to understand what that means practically, she continued, and the precision came back into her voice, not as armor this time, but as honesty. I'm not easy to be around constantly. I have a very high threshold for the way I work, and I have physical limitations that require logistics that are sometimes complicated, and I have years of habits built around protecting myself from exactly the kind of vulnerability this requires. She paused. I'm telling you that because I want you to walk in with accurate information. Vivian, I mean it. I know you mean it. He leaned forward slightly, and I want you to understand what this means practically on my end. I have a 7-year-old daughter who is the primary organizing fact of my life. I have an ex-wife who is a decent co-parent and an occasional source of complication. I make a facilities manager's salary, and I live in a 2-bedroom apartment, and the most exciting thing I did this winter was successfully get the HVAC replaced before it failed. He held her eyes. I'm not a project. I'm not an interesting case study. I'm a person with a specific, particular life, and this is what that life looks like. Walk in with accurate information. She held his gaze for a long moment. Okay, she said. And then, slowly, imperfectly, with the slightly stunned quality of someone who had prepared for 10 different versions of a moment and was receiving an 11th, she smiled. Not the corner of the mouth thing he'd cataloged over months. An actual smile, brief and unguarded, the kind that people produced when they hadn't remembered to prevent it. He didn't comment on it. He filed it, carefully, and moved on. So, he said. What now? I have no idea, she said. That's honest. I'm trying to be better about that. He thought for a moment. Ella has a school thing on Saturday, a science fair thing. She made a project about fish migration. I'm going. If you wanted to come, you could come. She blinked. To a 2nd grade science fair? To a 2nd grade science fair. Where your daughter will be. Where my daughter will be, yes. She looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating in real time. That's a significant step. It's a science fair. The stakes are mostly construction paper and colored markers. He paused. But yes, it's a step. I'm suggesting it because Ella is the center of my life, and anyone who's going to be in my life eventually has to be in that part of it. And I thought, if we're trying this like it's real, that probably sooner matters more than later. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her working through it. Not the decision. He thought she'd already made the decision, but the adjustment required to actually do the thing she'd decided. What time? She said. 9:30. It's at Westbrook Elementary, which has accessible parking, and I know how to manage accessible logistics, she said, gently but clearly. Right. He stopped himself. Sorry. Don't apologize. But don't manage me. Understood. He nodded. 9:30. I'll text you the address. He didn't tell Ella ahead of time. He considered it and decided against it. Not because he was hiding anything, but because Ella's expectations, once formed, operated with a specific gravity that wasn't always helpful. He wanted the introduction to be as natural as things between a 7-year-old and a new adult could be, which was to say he wanted to give it the best possible conditions and then get out of the way. The science fair was in the school gymnasium, which smelled of floor polish and the particular combination of kid energy and construction paper projects. Each student had a table with their display. Ella's was on the far wall, a large blue and white trifold with the title, Where Do Fish Go? In letters she'd cut from a magazine, surrounded by drawings she'd made of migration routes. She was standing beside it when he arrived, wearing her dark red dress that she'd requested specifically for the occasion and which she'd been very clear about not wrinkling, and she was talking to her teacher with the focused energy she brought to things she cared about. She saw him come through the door and waved. He found her table and she explained the project to him. The full version, more detailed than the notebook version, because the notebook had been research and this was presentation and she understood the difference. He listened and asked 2 questions that she seemed pleased by, and then she looked past him. Vivian had come in quietly and was moving toward them, and she had, he noticed immediately, left Priya at home, which meant she'd come alone, which said something about what she'd decided. Ella saw her when she was about 15 feet away. Kids were, in Mason's experience, either immediately at ease with his wheelchair or immediately uncertain, and the uncertainty usually produced either excessive politeness or avoidance. Ella studied Vivian for a moment with the direct analytical attention she brought to new information, and then turned to Mason. "Is that your friend?" she said. "Yeah, her name's Vivian." Ella looked back at Vivian with the expression of a person updating their files. "From work?" "From work." Vivian arrived at the table and looked at the display and then at Ella with the quality of attention she brought to things she was actually interested in. "Your dad told me about the fish research," she said. "You've been working on this for a while." Ella studied her. "Since November." "That's thorough." "I like knowing things properly," Ella said. Something moved through Vivian's expression. "I understand that completely." Ella seemed to register this as an adequate credential. She turned to the display and began explaining, with the full systematic detail of someone who had been waiting for an audience who could handle the complete version. And Vivian listened in the particular way she listened, without interrupting, without the performative nodding that adults used when they were waiting for a child to finish, but with actual attention, following the explanation, asking one question at exactly the right moment that made Ella stop and look at her with the expression she used when she encountered someone who had surprised her. "How do they know where to go?" Vivian asked. "Without a map, without ever having done it before." Ella considered this seriously. "The book says they use the Earth's magnetic field, like a compass inside them." She thought for a moment. "I think it's also just, they know, like how I know when I'm close to home, even if I'm not looking." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "That's a beautiful way to put it." Ella looked at her, then back at the display. "You can read the whole thing if you want," she said, which was, in Ella's social vocabulary, a significant gesture of approval. Mason stood back and let them be, and watched Vivian read Ella's project, and watched Ella watch Vivian read it, and felt something settle in his chest. Not resolution, not completion, just the particular feeling of pieces that have been separate for a long time occupying the same space without friction. Afterward, the 3 of them went to a diner 2 blocks from the school. It had been Ella's idea, stated simply and immediately. "Can we get pancakes?" Nobody had said no. The diner had booths and good light, and a kid's menu with a word search on the back that Ella began working through while they waited for their food, pencil moving steadily. Vivian had coffee. Mason had coffee. Ella had orange juice and a seriousness of purpose about the word search. "She does everything like that," Mason said quietly, nodding toward Ella. "Like what?" "Completely. Whatever she's doing, she's fully doing it." Vivian watched Ella circle a word with the satisfaction of someone finding something they'd looked for. "She gets that from you." He looked at her. "You think?" "You manage a building full of systems, and the one thing your team says about you is that nothing gets half your attention." She held his gaze. "I pay attention to more than what happens in meetings." "You've asked people about me?" "I read performance reviews." The corner of her mouth moved. "HR sends them to me as part of the annual operations summary. Your team's satisfaction scores are consistently high. The notes say you're thorough and fair, and you don't leave things undone." He sat with that for a moment, slightly off balance. "That's a strange thing to know about someone." "I know." She looked at her coffee cup. "I read it before any of this, before the text message. Just part of the annual review. And I thought, whoever this person is, they're doing their job the way it's supposed to be done." She looked up. "I noticed that. It's rarer than it should be." Ella looked up from the word search. "I found Atlantic." "Good," Mason said. "How many words?" Vivian asked. Ella counted the circled ones. 6 out of 12. "What's left?" Ella reviewed the remaining words and read them aloud with the seriousness of a briefing. Vivian pointed at the grid and said, "Try the bottom left corner." And Ella looked and found one immediately, and wrote her name at the top of the page with the authority of someone making it official. Mason watched this without saying anything. He watched Vivian lean slightly toward the table to see the word search grid, watched Ella explain the remaining ones with the confidence of someone who had decided this adult was worth explaining things to, and thought about what Vivian had said 3 weeks ago. "I thought about our conversation at the party, the part where I said I was starting to believe it." He thought about what she'd said today. "I want to try it like it's real." He thought about the fact that she was sitting in a diner booth over a kid's word search at 10:30 on a Saturday morning, and that nothing about it looked like effort, and that she had come alone, and that Ella had shown her the fish project with the full version of her attention, which was not given casually. The food arrived. Ella ate her pancakes with methodical focus. The conversation moved without direction. Ella asked Vivian if she'd ever seen a live fish up close, which led to a story about a trip Vivian had taken years ago where she'd seen something unexpected, and Ella listened with her chin in her hand and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated she'd been tracking the whole story. Mason mostly listened. He found sitting there that the talking wasn't something he needed to drive. It was happening on its own with its own logic, the way conversations did when the people in them were genuinely interested in each other. At one point, Ella looked at Vivian's wheelchair, the first time she'd looked at it directly, having made a calculated decision earlier, it seemed, not to, and said, "Does it go fast?" Vivian looked at her evenly. "Faster than you'd think. Faster than walking?" "About the same as a brisk walk. On flat ground." She paused. "Faster downhill." Ella considered this. "That seems fun." "It has its moments." There was something in Vivian's voice that was dry and warm at the same time. Ella nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her pancakes. April arrived and settled, and things moved forward in the way that real things moved. Not smoothly, not without friction, but forward. Mason and Vivian fell into a pattern that was different from what they'd had before. The meetings still happened, but they weren't the entire thing anymore. They texted occasionally. She sent him an article once about building ventilation systems and wrote "thought of you" in the message, which he found disproportionately funny. He sent her a photo of the view from the server room corridor one morning when the light came through the single high window at an unexpected angle and made the utilitarian space look, briefly, like something else. She'd replied, "You see things other people don't." He'd written back, "So do you. You just usually aim it at spreadsheets." A pause, then, "I'm working on that." He picked her up for dinner one Thursday evening in late April. Not a work context, just dinner, a restaurant he'd chosen because it had been recommended to him and because it had good access. She was outside her building when he pulled up, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected her to be inside in the lobby, and instead she was in the evening air with her coat on and a slight wind moving her hair, and she looked like a person who had decided to be outside rather than someone waiting to move from one interior to another, which was a small thing. And also, he thought, not a small thing at all. They had dinner that lasted 2 hours, which was the longest they'd been together outside of a conference room. She ordered decisively and didn't consult him about it, which he appreciated. She told him, over the middle part of the meal, about the company's pending leadership restructure. A COO. She'd been recruiting for a year and a half, who had finally committed, which meant that in the next 6 months, she could realistically offload the operational weight she'd been carrying solo since founding the company, which meant, she said this looking at him steadily across the table, that the part of her life that existed outside the boardroom had room to expand. "I've been running this company like there's nothing else," she said, "because for a long time there wasn't. And now? And now I'm making a deliberate decision that there is." She held his gaze. "That's new for me. How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly, which he'd come to love about her, the refusal to answer before she'd actually checked. "Terrifying," she said, "and correct." He drove her home after dinner through the April city, the streets wet from earlier rain, the lights doubling in the puddles on the asphalt. She was quiet in the passenger seat with the quality of quiet he'd learned to read. Not absence, just contentment. The particular silence of someone who had somewhere to be and was at ease being there. He pulled up to her building. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "Thank you for coming." She looked at him. "I want to meet Ella again. More intentionally. Not at a science fair where I'm one of 15 adults she's talking to." "She'd like that. She mentioned you twice last week. The fish thing, she wants to tell you what she found out about magnetic fields." "I want to hear it." She said it like she meant it. "I know you do." She reached over, not dramatically, without announcement, and put her hand briefly on his arm. Just a moment, the kind of contact that said something specific without requiring translation. "Good night, Mason." "Good night." She went inside, and he sat for a moment in the idling car, the rain-wet street reflecting the building lights, and thought about a Tuesday night 6 months ago when he'd been sitting on the floor of his kitchen with his back against the cabinet under the sink and his heart somewhere south of his stomach, convinced he'd destroyed the most stable thing in his life with one careless tap on a phone screen. He thought about all the ways that night had turned out to be the beginning of something rather than the end. He pulled into traffic and drove home through the April dark, and the city moved around him in its ordinary, indifferent way, and he was not looking at any of it with indifference. He was looking at all of it with the specific attention of someone who had been reminded, at 32, that the things that changed your life didn't announce themselves. They arrived as accidents, as wrong turns, as a message sent to the wrong person at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. What you did with them after that was entirely up to you. He got home to find Mrs. Tron watching a nature documentary with Ella, who was supposed to be in bed but had leveraged a negotiation. Mason could tell from Mrs. Tran's expression that she'd been worn down with great charm, and was sitting on the couch in her pajamas with the rabbit, eyes bright. "You're supposed to be asleep," he said. "There was a thing about whales," Ella said. He looked at Mrs. Tron. She spread her hands in a gesture that communicated it had been a compelling case. He paid her, thanked her, and sat on the couch next to Ella for the last 15 minutes of the documentary. She leaned against his arm. On screen, something large and ancient moved through blue-black water, following the path it had always followed, the path built into it somewhere below instinct and above knowledge. "Daddy," Ella said, half drowsy. "Yeah." "Is Vivian going to come over sometime?" He looked at the top of her head, the soft mess of her hair. "Yeah," he said. "I think she is." "Good," Ella said, and closed her eyes. He sat with her until she was actually asleep, then carried her to bed and pulled the comforter up and left the door the right amount of open. He stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet apartment, the city's faint ambient sound coming through the window glass, and felt, not happiness exactly, or not only that, but the particular weight of a life that was full, not complete. Not without its frictions and its hard edges and the things that hadn't healed all the way, but full, in the way that mattered, with people who were real in it. He went to bed. He slept without difficulty. The COO started in June. Her name was Diane Marsh, 51 years old, 20 years of operational leadership across 3 different industries, and a reputation for walking into complicated organizations and making them function without breaking the things that were already working. Vivian had recruited her personally over 18 months, which Mason had understood, from things she'd said in passing, was both the longest and most important hire she'd ever made. He watched the transition happen from his floor, not the details, those were above his level, and appropriately so, but the texture of it, which was visible in small ways. The number of all-hands communications increased slightly. There were new faces in the executive elevator bank. 2 of the senior operations people who had been reporting directly to Vivian began routing things through a new chain. These were the signs of a structure shifting, weight redistributing, a system finding a new equilibrium. What he watched more closely was Vivian. She told him, over dinner in April, that bringing on Diane meant she could stop running the company as if it were the only thing in her life. He'd understood that as an intention. What he hadn't been entirely prepared for was how hard it would be for her to actually do it. Not because she didn't mean it, but because habits built over a decade didn't dissolve because you'd decided to dissolve them. She still worked late. She still carried the weight of decisions that were no longer technically hers to carry alone. He could tell on the evenings they talked because there was a specific quality to her voice when she'd been sitting in the problem of something for too long without stepping back from it, a tightness that she wasn't always aware of. He told her this once, in June, on a Thursday evening when she'd called him while he was washing dishes, and the conversation had started as one thing and become another. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Holding the whole building up, even when there's someone else to help hold it." A pause on the line. "I'm aware. Being aware and doing something about it are different things." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. He heard the faint sound of her moving, the particular subtle sound of her chair on her office floor. "It's not easy to stop." "I know. I've been doing it since I was 23. "I know that too." He dried the pot, hung it. What would it feel like to put some of it down? Just one thing. Tonight. Another pause. Longer. "Probably fine," she said. "I'm scared it would feel like failure." "You cleared an investigation, hired a COO, restructured your leadership team, and managed to have dinner with a facilities manager and his kid twice in the last 2 months," he said. "You're not failing. You're learning to do a thing differently." The silence was the particular kind that meant she was receiving something and letting it settle rather than responding immediately. He'd learned to leave that silence alone. "Ella wants to show you something," he said, changing course deliberately. She finished a new notebook. This one is about migratory birds. She moved from fish to birds. She moves when she feels like she's learned enough about something. It's a system. He could hear the change in Vivian's voice when he mentioned Ella. A slight softening, the careful precision loosening by a degree. It had been happening since the science fair, building through the dinner in April, through a Saturday afternoon in May when Ella had come to Vivian's building with Mason, and they'd walked, or moved, in Vivian's case, along the river path nearby for 90 minutes, while Ella talked about everything she'd been thinking about, which was extensive. Ella had taken to Vivian with the matter-of-fact ease she brought to things she'd decided were good. She didn't romanticize it, didn't perform her acceptance of it. She just absorbed Vivian into the fabric of her life, with the particular directness of a child who assessed people by how they actually behaved rather than what category they occupied. Vivian had not been easy about it at first. Mason had watched her, in those early interactions, navigate the particular uncertainty of someone who cared about getting something right and wasn't sure of the rules. She'd been careful in ways that had showed, slightly more formal than the situation required, asking Mason afterward whether she'd said the right things, which he'd found both touching and slightly heartbreaking that she'd needed to ask. "You were fine," he'd told her. "I didn't know what was appropriate." "She's 7. Appropriate mostly means paying attention and telling her the truth." "I can do those things. I know you can. You did." Over time, the carefulness had softened into something more natural. She'd found a frequency with Ella that he hadn't engineered and hadn't expected. Something to do with the fact that they were both people who thought in systems, who wanted to understand things completely before moving on, who preferred the truth delivered plainly to the truth delivered gently at the cost of accuracy. He thought sometimes about what it meant that his daughter and the woman he was in love with shared those qualities. He didn't think about it too hard. Some things were better received as gifts than interrogated as coincidences. He realized fully and without ambiguity that he was in love with her on a Tuesday evening in late June. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It didn't arrive with any of the machinery that stories usually assign to realizations of this kind. He was sitting in her apartment. They'd progressed to her apartment by May, which had felt like a significant step, and then, once it happened, felt simply like the natural extension of where things already were. And she was reading something on her laptop, and he was reading something on his phone, and neither of them was talking. And the apartment was quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that existed between two people who were comfortable enough with each other that silence didn't require filling. He looked up at some point and looked at her. The sharp line of her profile, the focused quality of her attention on the screen, the way one hand rested on the arm of her chair and the other held a coffee cup that had probably gone cold. And he thought, with the clarity of something that had been true for a while and was only now being named, "I love her. I love this specific person in front of me, with all her precision and her difficulty and her 11 years of practice distance and her laugh that she still seemed slightly surprised by when it arrived." He looked at her for a moment and she looked up and caught him at it. "What?" she said. "Nothing." She studied him with the expression she used when she suspected he was being imprecise. That wasn't a nothing face. I'll tell you later. She held his gaze for another beat, then went back to her screen. Okay. He went back to his phone and sat there in the quiet apartment and felt the weight and the lightness of the thing he'd named, the two qualities somehow existing simultaneously, the way love did when it was real and you knew it, and it was still terrifying and still completely right. He told her later. Not that night. That night felt like too much, like crowding a moment that was already full. He told her on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks later, in July, when Ella was at her mother's for the weekend and Vivian had come to his apartment for the first time. She'd been there for about an hour, in the small kitchen while he cooked. Something he'd made before, reliable, nothing that required him to perform. And they'd been talking about something that didn't matter particularly, some peripheral story about a situation at her company, and he'd been listening and watching her talk with her hands the way she did when she was engaged in something, and he'd thought, now. I'm in love with you, he said. She stopped talking mid-sentence. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of something on the stove. She looked at him. He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window at the angle it did in July, warm and slightly amber, and the apartment around them was ordinary and specific and entirely his. The second-hand couch visible in the living room, the permission slip he still hadn't dealt with on the counter, the pen with no cap somewhere it shouldn't be. I know it's soon, he said, or not soon. We've been doing this for 8 months, but in terms of saying it out loud, he paused. I just wanted you to have the information. She held his gaze for a long moment. Something was moving through her face, so not the controlled version, not the version she showed the room, but the real version. The one he'd been seeing in pieces since November and now saw when she let herself be seen, almost whole. I'm not going to say it back right now, she said. Her voice was steady and serious and not unkind. Not because I don't, but because I need to say it when I'm ready to say it, not as a response to you saying it. Do you understand what I mean? Yes, he said, and he did. I need it to be mine, she said, when I say it, not an echo. I understand. She held his gaze. You're not hurt by that. No. Most people would be. I know why you said it the way you said it, he said, and I'd rather have it from you when it's real than have it from you right now, because I said it first. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, without announcing it, without making it a thing, she crossed the small kitchen and took his hand. She didn't say anything, she just held it, and he held hers. And they stayed like that for a moment in the July afternoon, while something on the stove made a sound that meant he should probably pay attention to it. He paid attention to it. She stayed for dinner. She said it on a Sunday in August, in his car, when they were driving back from the river path where Ella had spent an hour explaining her bird research to Vivian with the complete authority of someone who had done the work and knew the material. Ella was asleep in the back seat. She had the ability to fall asleep in vehicles with great speed, a gift she'd had since infancy, and the city moved past the windows in the late summer light. Vivian was looking out the passenger window. He wasn't looking at her, says he was watching the road. And she said, without preamble, without the framing he'd half expected, I love you too. I've known for a while. I needed it to be the right moment. He said nothing for a moment. He kept his eyes on the road. Okay, he said. That's all? What did you want me to say? I don't know. He could hear a smile in her voice. Something more. I told you I was in love with you in my kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, and you said you weren't going to say it back yet, and I said I understood. And we had dinner. He glanced at her. I'm not going to make a bigger thing out of this than I did out of that. A pause. Then quietly, she laughed. The real one, the one that still arrived like it surprised her. And he heard Ella shift in the back seat and said nothing else and drove. September brought the renegotiation of his own position at the company, which he hadn't initiated and hadn't expected. Vivian had disclosed their relationship to the board in August, proactively, formally, without asking his permission because she hadn't needed it, and had proposed that he no longer report into the operations chain that ultimately reported to her, but instead into the new COO structure under Diane Marsh, which created a clean separation and addressed any conflict of interest concern before it could be raised. She told him about this after it was done. He'd sat with it for a moment. You handled it. It was mine to handle. You'd have done it differently and it would have been less effective. He couldn't argue with that. Diane is good. She's very good. She'll give you less latitude than I did. I'll manage. I know you will. She'd looked at him with the directness he'd come to understand as one of her forms of tenderness. You deserve to be evaluated on your work, not on your relationship to me. This makes that possible. He'd thought about that for a while afterward. The deliberateness of it, the foresight. She'd protected something before it needed protecting, which was exactly the way she operated with things she valued. He'd found it, unexpectedly, one of the most clearly loving things she'd ever done for him, in a list that was getting long. The transition to Diane's structure was professionally smooth and personally unremarkable. Diane was direct and organized and had high standards and didn't treat him any differently than she treated the rest of the operations team, which was exactly what he wanted. He did his job well and was evaluated as doing it well and came home at the end of the day to a life that existed in full, which was all he'd ever actually wanted from work. October brought a cold snap that arrived early and stayed. The city went from late summer to autumn in what felt like a week, the kind of temperature drop that made the world smell different, leaves and wood smoke and something in the air like the whole season was turning over. Ella went through a phase of wearing only orange and yellow, which she maintained was because those were the best autumn colors, and which Mason suspected was also partly because she'd been influenced by a book about monarch butterflies she'd read 3 times. Vivian came to dinner at the apartment twice in October. The second time, Ella had asked her to stay for a movie, specifically a nature documentary about bird migration, which she'd selected with pointed intent. And Vivian had stayed, sitting beside Ella on the second-hand couch that Mason had bought off a neighbor 3 years ago, and which remained, inexplicably, the most comfortable piece of furniture he'd ever encountered. He'd sat on Ella's other side and watched about 20 minutes of the documentary before noticing that Ella had moved from sitting beside Vivian to sitting slightly against her, the way she did when she was tired and comfortable and had decided someone was safe. Vivian hadn't moved or adjusted or made anything of it. She'd just stayed still, watching the screen, and her hand had come to rest lightly on the armrest near Ella's shoulder, not forcing contact, just available. Mason had looked at this and looked at the screen and not said anything. Later, after Ella was in bed and Vivian was getting ready to leave, he'd said, "She trusts you." "I know." Vivian's voice was quieter than usual. "I don't take that lightly." "I know you don't." She'd looked at him with the expression he'd first seen in a second-floor hallway in March, the face of someone who had walked towards something terrifying and was on the other side of it, and could see now what it had cost and what it had given, and was still calculating. "She's remarkable," she said. "She's genuinely remarkable. I want you to know that I understand what you have in her." "I know you do." "I didn't think I'd be good at this," she said. "This particular part, being around a child, earning it. You're earning it the same way you earn everything," he said, "by showing up and being real about it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You make things sound simpler than they are." "They're not simple," he said. "They're just clear." The weekend away had been Vivian's idea. She'd mentioned it first in October, and it had become real by November. A 3-day weekend, a rented house in the mountains 3 hours north of the city, snow in the forecast. She'd researched it carefully, which he'd known she would, and she'd asked his input on the practical considerations, which he'd known she would, and when the booking was confirmed, she'd sent him the details with the single-line message, not as CEO and employee, as something better. He'd read that twice and then gone to tell Ella. Ella's response had been immediate and logistical. She wanted to know if there would be snow, whether the house had a fireplace, whether she should bring her binoculars for birds, and whether Vivian was going to be there the whole time. "The whole time," Mason said. Ella considered. "Good," she said, and went back to her book. They left on a Friday morning in late November, the city still dark when Mason loaded the car. Ella was dressed and ready, with a precision that suggested she'd been awake earlier than she'd admitted, her backpack already by the door, binoculars around her neck. She climbed into the back seat and buckled herself and said, "Ready?" with the finality of a person who had been ready for some time. They picked up Vivian at 7:15. She was outside, again outside, not waiting in the lobby. In her coat, a bag in her lap, her breath making small clouds in the cold November air. Ella said from the back seat, "Hi, Vivian." Vivian looked in through the window and said, "Good morning. Are you wearing binoculars to a car?" "In case of birds." "In the car." "On the way." Vivian looked at Mason. He spread his hands. This is who she is. Vivian's expression did the thing he loved, the lightness arriving without announcement. "Fair enough," she said. The drive north took 3 hours and change, moving through the flat of the city and into the changing landscape, the trees coming in denser, the elevation rising by degrees. Ella fell asleep within 40 minutes, the binoculars still around her neck, her head against the window. Mason drove. Vivian sat beside him and they talked. Not about work, not about logistics. Just talked, the way they'd learned to talk over a year of practicing it, with the ease of people who knew each other's rhythms. She told him about a memory she'd had that week, something her father had said when she was 12, the year she'd been writing business analyses in her notebook, about how being good at something wasn't the same as being happy doing it, and how she hadn't understood what he'd meant until she was 30. "Do you understand it now?" Mason asked. "More than I did." She looked at the road ahead of them. "I'm good at running a company. I'll probably always be good at it, but I spent a long time confusing being good at it with it being enough. And it wasn't. It was never going to be." She was quiet for a moment. "I needed this, whatever this is. I needed the part where I'm just a person who has people and not just a function that runs well." He drove for a while in silence that was full rather than empty. "My ex-wife," he said eventually, "used to say that I was better at the work of a relationship than the feeling of it, that I showed up and handled things, but I wasn't all the way present." Was she right? He considered it honestly. "Partly. I think I'd gotten good at managing things from a slight distance because it felt safer than being fully in them. After the divorce, I told myself that was just how I was wired." He paused. "I don't think that's true anymore." "What changed?" He glanced at her. "You made being fully present feel worth the risk." She held that quietly. He let her hold it. In the back seat, Ella stirred, said something in her sleep that neither of them could make out, and went still again. The house was at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by trees heavy with the season's last leaves and the early suggestion of snow in the sky. It was stone and wood and larger than he'd expected. Vivian had been specific about the accessibility requirements, and the result was a house with wide doorways and a single level and a fireplace in the main room that Ella identified immediately and stood in front of with a proprietorial satisfaction. "I knew it," she said. They settled in through the afternoon, bags unpacked, the fireplace going by 4 o'clock. Ella outside for 30 minutes on the deck with her binoculars before the cold drove her in with a report on 2 species she'd identified. Vivian was at the kitchen table with a book and looked up when Ella came in and said, "What did you find?" with the genuine interest she always brought to Ella's findings. Ella reported, in full, with the seriousness of a field scientist. Mason made dinner in the unfamiliar kitchen. A house you'd never cooked in before had its own language to learn. And they ate at a round table near the fire with the trees visible through the large windows going dark as the evening came in. Ella talked. Vivian asked questions. Mason listened and ate, and felt the particular quality of an evening that was simple and complete, the kind that didn't require anything more than what it already was. After dinner, Ella negotiated 30 more minutes before bed, which was granted because the fireplace had earned it, and she spent them lying on her stomach on the rug in front of it, drawing birds in a sketchbook she'd brought specifically for this purpose, narrating occasionally. When she finally went to bed, the room she'd chosen with the window that faced the trees, Mason sat beside her and she said, in the drowsy voice of someone nearly already gone, "Daddy, I like this." "Which part?" "All of it." A pause. "Vivian fits." He sat with that for a moment. Yeah, he said. She does. Ella was asleep in 4 minutes. He sat with her for a bit after, in the dark of the unfamiliar room, listening to her breathe. Outside the window, the first snow was beginning. Not dramatically, just a quiet beginning, small flakes visible against the light from the exterior lamp. He watched it for a while. It was the kind of snow that didn't announce itself, the kind that arrived while you were doing something else, and by the time you noticed it, the whole world had been changed over. He thought about that. He thought about all the ways that was true. When he came back to the main room, Vivian was still by the fire. She'd put the book down and was looking at the flames, not thinking about something, he could tell, just being in the moment, which was still newer for her than it was for him, but which she was getting better at with a consistency that he found extraordinary in a person who'd spent a decade avoiding it. He sat beside her. The fire made the room warm and amber, and the snow was visible through the windows now, steady and quiet. She said, "You fit," he said. Vivian turned to look at him. What? Ella! Just now. She said you fit. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face that he'd never quite seen before. Not the controlled version of emotion, not the managed version, not even the unguarded version that came out sometimes in quieter moments. This was something older and deeper, something that had been waiting a long time for its specific conditions and had finally arrived at them. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Okay." "When I came to that hearing in March," she said, "and I said those things in front of that panel, it wasn't a strategic decision. I want to be clear about that. I didn't calculate it. I drove there knowing what I was going to say because I couldn't not say it. Because staying quiet would have meant pretending that you were just an employee and that what had been happening between us was just circumstance, and I couldn't do that." She paused. "I'd spent 11 years being strategic about everything I let matter to me. I was done being strategic about you." He held her gaze. "I know what I'm worth," she continued, and the steadiness of it was not arrogance, but something harder won. The statement of someone who had rebuilt their sense of themselves from the inside out after losing the version they'd expected to have. "I know what I've built. But for a long time I convinced myself that what I was worth was exactly what I'd built. The company, the record, the reputation. That those things were enough, and that wanting more than that was asking too much." She looked at the fire for a moment. "You didn't let me believe that. You didn't let yourself believe it," he said. "I just showed up." "You showed up every time, even when you didn't have to, even when it would have been easier to keep the distance." She looked back at him. "That's not nothing. I need you to know that I know that's not nothing." He reached over and took her hand. She let him take it. Not the brief contact of the kitchen in July, but a full hold, fingers interlaced, the kind of contact that said, "I'm here and I intend to stay here." "I know what you're worth too," he said. "Not the company, not the record. You, specifically. The person who reads Q4 reports on a Saturday because she actually cares whether the systems work. The person who listens to a 7-year-old talk about fish migration with her full attention. The person who drives to a hearing she wasn't invited to because letting something wrong stand uncorrected was something she couldn't live with." He held her gaze. "That's who I'm in love with." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire moved. Outside, the snow had deepened without drama, the trees holding it on their branches, the world going white and still. "I'm scared sometimes," she said, "that I'll revert, that I'll go back to the version of myself that keeps everyone at the right distance. I know." "You're not going to tell me I won't." "No." He was honest about it. "I'm going to tell you that when you do, I'll notice, and I'll tell you, and you'll probably push back and tell me I'm wrong and then think about it overnight and come back and say I wasn't wrong." He paused. "We'll handle it." She laughed. The real one, brief and unguarded. "That's an accurate prediction. I know how you work." "You really do." She looked at their joined hands, then up at him. "That's a strange thing, to be known." Strange good or strange bad? She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to things that deserved it. "Strange necessary," she said. "Strange like something you didn't know you were missing until you had it, and then you couldn't imagine how you'd managed without it." He understood that precisely. He'd felt it for months in different words. Outside, the snow continued to fall. It had been falling for a while now, the quiet accumulation of it, the world being slowly covered in something clean and temporary and genuinely beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when you weren't trying to hold on to them, just letting them be what they were, in the moment they were in. They stayed up past midnight, talking and not talking, the fire going low and then built back up once, the snow deepening outside the windows. There were no dramatic declarations after the ones that had already been made. There didn't need to be. What they had by midnight was what they'd been building, imperfectly, incrementally, through accidental text messages and forwarded threads and conference room conversations and a second-grade science fair and dinners and one complicated March morning in a room no one had wanted to be in over the better part of a year. It was not a perfect thing. It would not become a perfect thing. Vivian was still learning to put the company down and had days where she couldn't. Mason still had the particular stubbornness of a man who'd spent 3 years doing everything alone and sometimes forgot he didn't have to anymore. Ella was 7 and would be 8 and then 9. And each version of her would be wonderful and specific and would require them both to adjust in ways they couldn't predict yet. There were ex-wife logistics, board meetings, accessible venue planning, late nights that nobody scheduled, miscommunications that would require the patience of people who had decided each other was worth it. None of that was going to go away. But sitting there in the firelight with the snow outside and Ella asleep down the hall, Mason thought about what real things actually were. Not the version that movies made, not the version that required perfection or absence of complication or a specific kind of ending that tied everything together. Real things were the accumulation of small, honest moments. Real things were choosing someone on an ordinary Tuesday and then choosing them again on the Wednesday after that. Real things were the look on a person's face when they felt truly seen and weren't sure yet whether to stay in that feeling or run from it. Real things were Vivian, that first night, reading a text message at 11:51 p.m. from a facilities manager she'd never really noticed, and instead of deleting it and moving on, doing something with it, letting it in. Real things were Mason, on the floor of his kitchen with his back against the cabinet, convinced he'd destroyed something, not yet knowing that what he'd actually done was begin something. Real things were Ella, 7 years old, falling asleep against a woman she'd decided was safe, with the complete trust of someone who hadn't yet learned to protect herself from the truth of what she felt. These were the things that lasted, not the grand gestures, though Vivian walking into that hearing room would stay with him for the rest of his life. The ordinary accumulation of showing up, the choice made repeatedly to be present in your own life rather than managing it from a careful distance. In the morning, Ella woke before either of them and stood at the main room window in her pajamas looking at the snow with an expression of complete satisfaction, as if the world had arranged itself according to her preferences. Mason found her there at 7, made coffee, stood beside her. "It snowed a lot," she said. "Yeah. Do you think Vivian will want to go out in it?" "You can ask her." Ella considered the logistics. "I'll wait until she wakes up. She works a lot. She probably needs sleep." He looked at his daughter, Zipti. This specific, particular person who had been watching the adults around her since she was old enough to watch anything, assembling her understanding of the world with a care and thoroughness that sometimes still knocked the breath out of him. "When did you get so thoughtful?" he said. She shrugged without false modesty. "I pay attention." He drank his coffee. Outside, the snow sat on the trees and the roof of the porch, and the gravel road and everything else, white and unhurried. The morning coming in gray and clean. Vivian appeared at 8, moving through the doorway from the hall with the particular ease she had in spaces she'd spent enough time in to trust. She found them at the window. She looked at the snow. She looked at Ella. "Do you want to go out in it?" Ella said immediately. Mason looked at her. She spread her hands. I waited as long as I could. Vivian looked at the snow and then at Ella. "Absolutely," she said. They went out after breakfast, the three of them, into the cold white morning. The snow was 4 inches on the level ground, and Ella was in it immediately, dramatically, with the total commitment she brought to things she'd been waiting for. Vivian moved through it at the edge of the cleared path, which Mason had done before breakfast with a shovel he'd found in the entryway closet. He'd done it quietly, early, the way he did most of the practical things that made the spaces they occupied workable. She didn't comment on it. She never did. That was one of the things. At some point, Ella made a small snow thing. Not quite a snowman, more of a snow presence, a snow intention, and declared that it needed a name and that its name was Gerald. She explained Gerald's backstory to Vivian with complete conviction. Vivian listened to Gerald's backstory with complete attention and asked one follow-up question about Gerald's motivations that made Ella stop and look at her with the expression she used when someone had surprised her by being interested in exactly the right thing. Gerald didn't choose this, Ella explained seriously. He was made. He didn't ask to be a snow thing. That's a fairly complex position for a snow figure, Vivian said. Gerald contains multitudes, Ella said, which was a phrase she'd heard somewhere and was deploying with great confidence. Vivian looked at Mason with an expression that he translated accurately as, "Your child is extraordinary." He translated back with his expression, "I know. She's been like this since birth." They stood there in the snow, the three of them, in the cold, clear morning, with the trees around them holding their white weight, and Gerald standing in the yard containing his multitudes. And nothing was resolved in the way that dramatic moments resolved things in stories. There was no single instant of arrival, no final point of completion. There was just this: the morning, the snow, the specific people in it. And that was more than enough. That was when Mason thought about it later. Driving back through the mountains in the afternoon, Ella asleep again in the back, Vivian beside him watching the landscape move past. Everything. What they'd built wasn't a company or a record or a reputation. What they'd built was harder to name and took longer to make and couldn't be presented to a board or measured in a quarterly report. It was the kind of thing that existed between people who had chosen, repeatedly and imperfectly and without guarantees, to let each other in. You couldn't accidentally build that, even if you accidentally started it, even if it started with a wrong tap on a phone screen at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and a message sent to the wrong person, and a woman who read it at 11:51 and felt, for the first time in a long time, something specific and true and worth paying attention to. Even then, especially then, everything that came after was a choice. And they had chosen it, both of them, all three of them, in the only way that mattered, one ordinary day at a time, all the way through.